In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 different species had learned to coexist through careful diplomacy and mutual fear, there existed an unspoken rule. Some beings were too dangerous to approach, too terrifying to befriend, and too alien to understand. For 3 centuries, the Galactic Council had maintained peace by accepting that certain species were simply meant to remain isolated. Then humanity arrived, and with them came the most dangerous weapon the galaxy had ever encountered: the complete inability to judge others by their appearance. What followed would shatter every assumption about fear, friendship, and the true nature of monsters. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary act in the universe is simply saying, "I don't care what you look like." This is the story of how one human's indifference to horror changed everything. The transport hub of Nexus 7 buzzed with the controlled chaos of 1,000 different worlds meeting in one place. Crystalline Zelthians clicked across the polished floors, their translucent bodies refracting the artificial light into rainbow patterns. Furry Mokkaran traders haggled over prices in their musical language, while the tall, elegant Vailish glided between the crowds with their characteristic silent grace. But there was one area of the hub that remained conspicuously empty. Ambassador Kethvar of the Rathi Collective watched from his observation deck as beings from dozens of species unconsciously steered away from Terminal 17. Even the maintenance drones seemed to take longer routes to avoid that particular section. The reason was simple: she was there. Kailara of the Death Korai had arrived 3 hours ago on the last transport from the Outer Rim, and already the entire hub had reorganized itself around her presence, like water flowing around a stone. It wasn't intentional, of course. None of the species in the Galactic Council were deliberately cruel or discriminatory. They were all civilized beings, after all. But some fears ran deeper than civilization. The Death Korai were nightmare fuel made flesh. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, Kalara's body was a writhing mass of dark, oily tentacles that never seemed to stay still. Where other species had faces, she had a collection of what could generously be called sensory organs. Clusters of black, wet eyes that blinked independently, surrounded by smaller tendrils that tasted the air constantly. Her mouth, when it opened to speak, revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth and a throat that seemed to descend into an abyss. Even her voice was unsettling. When she spoke, it came from multiple sources at once, creating an echo effect that made listeners feel as though they were surrounded. Her words carried the wet sound of something that lived in the deep places of the galaxy, where light never reached. Kethvar had been present at the Galactic Council sessions where the Death Korai had been granted membership 50 years ago. The debate had lasted for months. They were undeniably intelligent, their technology was impressive, and their homeworld's strategic location made them valuable allies. But every species representative who looked at them felt the same primitive terror that had once made their ancestors fear the dark. The compromise had been isolation. The Death Korai could join the Council, but they would primarily interact through virtual interfaces. When physical presence was absolutely necessary, meetings would be held in specially designated areas with minimal contact with other species. It was a practical solution that satisfied no one, least of all the Death Korai themselves. Kailara had specifically requested this meeting because she served as her people's xenobiologist, one of their leading experts on other species. She claimed to have important information about a discovery on a remote world, something that could affect the entire galaxy. But getting other council members to actually sit in the same room with her had proven impossible. Until today, Kethvar checked his chronometer again. The human representative was late, which was typical. Humans had only joined the Galactic Council 18 months ago, and they were still adjusting to what they called Galactic Standard Time. Their species had a peculiar relationship with punctuality that baffled most other civilizations. The humans were odd in many ways. They were one of the few species that had developed on a death world, a planet so hostile that most council members couldn't survive there without environmental suits. Their homeworld, Earth, was a spinning ball of natural disasters, poisonous plants, predatory animals, and unstable weather patterns. Yet somehow, humanity had not only survived but thrived. They were also peculiar in their social structures. Most species had overcome their primitive tribal instincts before achieving space travel. But humans seemed to carry theirs with them wherever they went. They formed bonds quickly and intensely, often with beings they had just met. Their concept of friendship was broader and more inclusive than almost any other species in the galaxy. Perhaps most strangely of all, they seemed to lack the normal fear responses that kept other species alive. Human explorers would walk into dangerous situations that would make a Mokkaran warrior think twice. They approached unknown alien species with the same casual attitude they might show when meeting a neighbor. It was this last trait that had given Kethvar the idea. If anyone in the galaxy might be willing to actually sit in the same room as a Death Korai, it would be a human. The sound of footsteps echoed through the terminal, and Kethvar looked up to see Captain Sarah Chen walking toward him. She moved with the easy confidence typical of her species, seemingly unconcerned by the fact that she was walking through a section of the hub that every other being was actively avoiding. Sarah Chen was what humans called unremarkable in appearance. She stood about average height for her species, with dark hair pulled back in a practical style and brown eyes that seemed to notice everything around her. She wore the simple blue uniform of the human diplomatic corps with no unnecessary decorations. In a galaxy full of beings who communicated through color changes, bioluminescence, or elaborate displays, humans were almost aggressively plain. But Kethvar had learned not to underestimate them. "Ambassador Kethvar," Sarah said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Sorry I'm late. Had to help settle a dispute between some Rigelian traders and a Mokaran merchant. Something about the proper way to calculate shipping costs across hyperspace lanes." Kethvar accepted the handshake, still not entirely comfortable with the human custom of physical contact during greetings. "Think nothing of it, Captain Chen. I appreciate you coming at all. As I mentioned in my message, this is somewhat of an unusual situation." "You said something about meeting with a Death Korai representative?" Sarah looked around the empty terminal. "I don't see anyone else here." Kethvar gestured toward a section of the terminal that was hidden behind a partition wall. The other council members felt it would be more appropriate if the meeting were held in a more private setting. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. More private or more isolated? The question made Kethvar uncomfortable, partly because it was asked so directly, and partly because the answer was obvious. "Captain Chen, I'm not sure you understand the full situation. The Death Korai are difficult for most species to interact with. Their appearance can be quite disturbing to those not prepared for it. Disturbing how? They're what your species might call tentacled horrors. They resemble the creatures from your own mythology about sea monsters and ancient evils. Most beings experience an instinctive fear response when encountering them." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And you want me to meet with one because humans are supposed to be too stupid to be properly scared?" "I wouldn't put it quite like that," Kethvar said quickly. "But humans do seem to have a remarkable ability to look past physical appearances. Your species has a history of forming bonds with beings that other species find threatening or uncomfortable." This was true, though Kethvar didn't mention some of the more extreme examples. Humans had somehow managed to befriend the crystalline collective, despite their habit of accidentally cutting things with their razor-sharp bodies. They had established trade relationships with the hive mind subspecies, even though most other species found their collective consciousness deeply unsettling. There were even reports of humans keeping dangerous predatory animals from their homeworld as companions, though Kethvar wasn't sure if those stories were accurate. "What's her name?" Sarah asked. "I'm sorry?" "The Death Korai representative." "What's her name?" "Kailara," Kethvar said, surprised by the question. Most species referred to the Death Korai by their titles or species name. The idea of using personal names seemed almost too intimate. "And what does she want to talk about?" "She claims to have discovered something significant on a remote world in the Outer Rim. Something that could affect the security of the entire galaxy. But she's been unable to present her findings because no one is willing to sit in the same room with her long enough to hear what she has to say." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Kethvar could see her thinking it over. He had learned that humans often process decisions internally before speaking, unlike many species that thought out loud. "All right," she said finally. "Where is she?" Kethvar led her around the partition wall to a smaller waiting area that had been cordoned off from the main terminal. Kailara sat alone on a specially designed chair that could accommodate her unique physiology, her tentacles moving restlessly as she waited. When she saw them approaching, several of her eye clusters turned in their direction. Kethvar felt the familiar chill of instinctive fear run down his spine, the same response that had kept his ancestors alive on their predator-filled homeworld. Every part of his mind was screaming at him to run, to get as far away from this creature as possible. Sarah, on the other hand, simply walked forward and extended her hand. "Hi there," she said in her casual human way. "I'm Sarah Chen. You must be Kailara. Nice to meet you." The effect was immediate and profound. Kailara's tentacles stopped moving for the first time since Kethvar had arrived, Her multiple voices spoke in unison, creating a harmony of surprise that was almost musical.
You are not afraid.
Should I be? Sarah asked, her hand still extended. Ambassador Kethvar mentioned you had something important to discuss.
I figured the least I could do was show up and listen. For several long seconds, Kilara simply stared at the offered hand. Then, carefully, she extended one of her smaller tentacles to touch Sarah's palm, in what Kethvar realized was her species equivalent of a handshake. "I am Kilara of the Death Karai, xenobiologist of the Fourth Deep," she said, her multiple voices creating a sound like a choir. "And you are the first being outside my own species to offer me a greeting in 57 years. Sarah shook the tentacle gently, as naturally as if she were greeting any other being. "Well, that's just poor manners on everyone else's part, isn't it? Should we sit down and talk about whatever it is you've discovered?" Kethvar watched in amazement as the two of them settled into chairs facing each other. Sarah showed no sign of discomfort or fear, treating Kilara exactly as she would any other council representative. The Death Karai, for her part, seemed almost overwhelmed by the simple act of normal social interaction. "Before we discuss my discovery," Kilara said, her voice is soft with something that might have been wonder. "May I ask you a question, Captain Chen?" "Sure. Do you truly feel no fear when you look at me? No instinctive urge to flee or defend yourself?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Honestly, you're definitely one of the more unique-looking individuals I've met since joining the Council. But fear? No, I don't think so. You remind me a bit of an octopus, actually. We have those on Earth. Incredibly intelligent creatures, though much smaller than you. I always thought they were kind of beautiful in their own way." The comparison seemed to please Kilara. Several of her tentacles moved in what Kethvar had learned was the Death Karai equivalent of a smile. "You compare me to creatures from your homeworld? The resemblance is pretty strong, yeah. Though, obviously, you're much more advanced. I'm guessing your people evolved in an aquatic environment?" "The deep trenches of our world's vast oceans," Kilara confirmed. "We developed our intelligence in the absolute darkness of the deepest places, where pressure could crush most beings and light never reaches." "That explains the multiple eyes and the sensory tentacles," Sarah said with genuine interest. "Must have been a challenging environment to evolve in." "Your people probably have incredible sensory capabilities compared to most surface-dwelling species." Kethvar realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. A normal conversation between a human and a Death Karai, as if they were simply two individuals getting to know each other, rather than representatives of species that had barely been able to exist in the same space. "Captain Chen," Kilara said, and her multiple voices carried a warmth that Kethvar had never heard from a Death Karai before. "I believe I understand now why your species has gained such a reputation for successful first contact scenarios."
"We do seem to be pretty good at making friends," Sarah agreed with a smile.
"Now, what was it you wanted to tell the Council about your discovery?" Kilara's demeanor suddenly became serious, her tentacles moving in patterns that Kethvar recognized as signs of urgency. 3 months ago, my research team was investigating a dead world in the Kepler 442 system. The planet had once supported a thriving ecosystem, but all life had been extinguished approximately 5,000 years ago. We were trying to determine the cause of the extinction. She paused, several of her eye clusters focusing on something in the distance, as if she were reliving the memory. What we found was evidence of a weapon unlike anything in the Council's databases. The entire planet had been subjected to some form of directed energy that didn't just kill the living beings on its surface, it corrupted them at a molecular level, turning their own biology against them. Sarah leaned forward, her casual demeanor replaced by professional attention. "What kind of energy are we talking about?" "That's the problem," Kilara said, her voices taking on an ominous harmony. "We don't know. The weapon left a signature that doesn't match any known technology from any Council species. But more concerning is what we found in the archaeological record." "Which was?" "Evidence that this same weapon has been used at least 17 times in the past 10,000 years, always on worlds that were developing spaceflight capability. Someone or something has been systematically eliminating species just as they're about to join the galactic community." The implications of this statement hit Kethvar like a physical blow. A weapon that could destroy entire worlds being used to prevent species from achieving spaceflight? It suggested the presence of a hostile force that had been operating in the galaxy for millennia, picking off developing civilizations before they could become threats. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. Then she asked the question that Kethvar had been dreading. Why hasn't this been reported to the full council? Kylara's tentacles moved in what Kethvar recognized as a gesture of frustration. Because every time I request a formal hearing, the other representatives find excuses to avoid meeting with me. They schedule virtual conferences, then claim technical difficulties. They request written reports, then file them away without reading them. For 3 months, I've been trying to warn the galaxy about a potential threat, and no one will listen because they cannot bear to look at me long enough to hear what I have to say. The raw pain in her multiple voices was unmistakable. Here was a being who had made what could be the most important discovery in galactic history, and she was being ignored simply because other species found her appearance disturbing. Sarah stood up suddenly, and for a moment Kethvar thought she was going to leave. Instead, she began pacing, which he had learned was how humans processed complex problems. "Okay," she said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm calling an emergency session of the Security Council. Full attendance, mandatory presence required, and I'm going to make sure that you get to present your findings to every single representative, whether they like it or not." "Captain Chen," Kethvar interjected, "I'm not sure the other council members will." "Will what?" Sarah's voice carried an edge that Kethvar had never heard from a human before. "Will do their jobs? Will listen to vital intelligence about a potential threat to galactic security? Will act like professional diplomats instead of scared children?" She turned to face Kylara directly. "How much evidence do you have? Can you prove everything you're telling us?" "My research team documented everything," Kylara said, her voices carrying a note of hope for the first time. "We have geological samples, energy readings, archaeological evidence, and comparative analysis with similar sites on other worlds. The data is comprehensive and verifiable." "Then we're going to make sure everyone sees it," Sarah said firmly. "Ambassador Kethvar, I need you to send out emergency summons to all Security Council members. Full attendance required within 24 hours. If anyone tries to decline, tell them that the Human Diplomatic Corps is invoking Article 7 of the Council Charter." Kethvar's feathers ruffled in surprise. Article 7 allowed any member species to demand immediate council attention for matters of galactic security, but it hadn't been invoked in over a century. "Captain Chen, are you certain you want to?" "Absolutely certain," Sarah said. "Kylara, I want you to prepare a full presentation of your findings, everything you've discovered, all the evidence, and your analysis of what it means for galactic security. You're going to present it to the full council, and they're going to listen to every word." "But Captain Chen," Kylara said, her voice uncertain, "the other council members will not wish to remain in the same room with me for the length of time required for a full presentation." Sarah stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "Then they're going to have to get over it, aren't they? Because sometimes doing the right thing means being uncomfortable. And if they can't handle looking at someone who's trying to save their lives, then maybe they don't deserve to be saved." The conviction in her voice was absolute. Kethvar realized that he was witnessing something that would likely become legendary in galactic history. The moment when a human decided that something was going to change, regardless of how difficult or uncomfortable that change might be. "Besides," Sarah added with a slight smile, "I'll be there with you. If a room full of diplomats can't be as brave as one human, then that says more about them than it does about you." For the first time since Kethvar had known her, Kylara's tentacles moved in the complex pattern that indicated deep gratitude among the Death Korai. Her multiple voices created a harmony that was almost song-like as she spoke. "Captain Chen, you have given me something I thought I would never experience, the hope that I might be heard."
"Everyone deserves to be heard," Sarah replied simply, "especially when they have something important to say."
As Kethvar watched the two of them work out the details of the emergency council session, he reflected on how much things were about to change.
For 50 years, the galaxy had accepted that some beings were simply too different, too frightening, too alien to interact with normally. It had been a compromise that seemed to work, allowing for a fragile peace based on mutual avoidance rather than mutual understanding. But humans, it seemed, didn't believe in such compromises. They had looked at the Death Korai and seen not a monster to be feared, but a person to be respected. They had taken one of the galaxy's most fundamental assumptions, that some differences were simply too great to overcome, and casually dismantled it with 3 simple words: "I don't care." The emergency council session would begin in 24 hours, and Kethvar suspected that nothing in galactic politics would ever be the same again, because once the other species saw a human sitting calmly next to a death Karai, treating her as an equal, and listening to her warnings about galactic security, they would be forced to confront their own prejudices and fears. And if Kalara's discovery was as significant as she claimed, they would also be forced to confront the possibility that their survival might depend on embracing the very differences they had spent so long trying to avoid. As he prepared to send out the emergency summons, Kethvar couldn't help but wonder what other assumptions about the galaxy were about to be challenged by humanity's peculiar inability to be properly afraid of anything. The Grand Council Chamber of Nexus 7 had been designed with one principle in mind: to make every species feel comfortable and represented. The massive circular room featured environmental zones adjusted for different atmospheric needs, seating designed for various physiologies, and lighting that could be modified to accommodate beings who saw in different spectrums. What it had never been designed for was the current situation. Ambassador Kethvar stood at the central podium, watching as representatives from 43 different species filed into the chamber with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. The emergency summons had been met with exactly the kind of resistance he had expected, but the invocation of Article 7 had left them no choice but to attend. The Valish delegation had arrived first, their tall, ethereal forms moving with their characteristic silent grace as they took their seats in the upper tier. Ambassador Thelnara's usually serene expression showed signs of strain, and she kept glancing toward the sealed entrance where Kylara would soon enter. The Mokran traders had protested the loudest about the emergency session, claiming it would interfere with crucial trade negotiations. Their furry forms chittered anxiously as they settled into their specialized seating, their musical language creating a discord of worried tones. Even the usually unflappable crystalline collective seemed agitated. Their representative, a being known as Harmony of Seven Voices, kept shifting their translucent form in patterns that indicated deep discomfort. But it was the empty space around the central floor that told the real story. Every species had instinctively positioned themselves as far as possible from where Kylara would be presenting, creating a conspicuous buffer zone that spoke louder than any formal protest. Captain Sarah Chen sat in the human delegation area, reviewing the presentation materials that Kylara had prepared. She seemed completely oblivious to the tension in the room, treating the situation as if it were just another routine diplomatic meeting. Kethvar had come to realize that this was one of humanity's most dangerous traits, their ability to remain calm in situations that should, by all rights, terrify them. The chamber doors opened with a soft hiss, and the conversations died instantly. Kylara entered with the fluid grace characteristic of her species, her dark tentacles moving in complex patterns as she navigated the room. She carried herself with dignity, but Kethvar could see the subtle signs of nervousness in the way her smaller sensory tendrils tasted the air more frequently than usual. The reaction was immediate and universal. Several representatives physically recoiled in their seats. The Mokran delegation's chittering became a high-pitched whine of distress. Even Harmony of Seven Voices shifted their crystalline form to its most defensive configuration. But Sarah Chen stood up and walked over to meet Kylara at the central presentation area. "Ready for this?" she asked in the same casual tone she might use to ask about the weather. "I have prepared extensively," Kylara replied, her multiple voices creating their characteristic harmony. "Though I confess I am uncertain how to proceed if the council representatives refuse to remain in the chamber." "They'll stay," Sarah said with confidence. "They might not like it, but they'll stay. Politicians are politicians, regardless of what species they come from. No one wants to be the one who walked out on a security briefing and then got blamed if something went wrong." She was right, of course. Despite the visible discomfort throughout the chamber, none of the representatives had actually left. They might be afraid, but they were also professionals with responsibilities to their respective governments. Kethvar activated the chamber's recording systems and stepped forward to address the assembly. "Honored representatives, thank you for responding to this emergency summons. The Human Diplomatic Corps has invoked Article 7 of the Council Charter to bring urgent security matters to our attention. I present Kylara of the Death Karai, xenobiologist of the Fourth Deep, who will brief us on discoveries that may affect the security of all Council worlds." The formal introduction did little to ease the tension in the room. If anything, the reminder that they were required to listen to a Death Karai seemed to make several delegates even more uncomfortable. Kylara moved to the center of the presentation area, her tentacles arranging themselves in what Kethvar recognized as a formal speaking posture. When she began, her multiple voices created a sound that was both alien and strangely compelling. "Honored representatives, 3 standard months ago, My research team was investigating mass extinction events on dead worlds in the Outer Rim territories. What we discovered challenges our fundamental understanding of galactic history and suggests the presence of a threat that has been systematically eliminating spacefaring civilizations for over 10 millennia. She gestured, and the chamber's holographic display systems activated, showing images of a barren world scarred by some unimaginable catastrophe. The planet's surface was twisted into impossible shapes, as if the very laws of physics had been temporarily suspended during its destruction. This is Kepler 442b, formerly home to the Xithtai civilization. According to our analysis, they achieved spaceflight approximately 5,000 years ago and had established colonies on 3 neighboring worlds. Within a single solar cycle of launching their first interstellar vessels, their entire species was extinct. The images shifted to show microscopic analysis of soil samples and geological formations. Even through the holographic display, there was something disturbing about the molecular structures they revealed. The weapon used against them did not simply destroy their cities or poison their atmosphere, Clara continued. It fundamentally altered the biological processes of every living thing on the planet. Their own cellular structures were corrupted and turned against them. They literally consumed themselves at the molecular level. Ambassador Thelnara of the Valish delegation leaned forward despite her obvious discomfort. What type of energy signature could produce such effects? That is the problem, honored representative. The energy signature matches no known technology in Council databases. It appears to operate on principles that our current understanding of physics cannot explain. But more disturbing is the pattern we discovered when we expanded our investigation. The holographic display changed to show a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy, with points of light marking various star systems. As Kailara manipulated the display, the lights began to change colors, creating a pattern that made several representatives gasp in recognition. 17 worlds spread across the galaxy, all showing the same type of destruction. All inhabited by species that had just achieved interstellar travel, all destroyed by the same unknown weapon. The most recent was Kepler 442b 5,000 years ago. The earliest we have been able to confirm was the Veltar homeworld, destroyed nearly 12,000 years ago. The implications were staggering. Someone or something had been stalking the galaxy for millennia, identifying developing civilizations and destroying them just as they became capable of expanding beyond their home systems. Representative Keistal of the Regelian Confederacy raised a crystalline appendage. If what you claim is accurate, why have we no records of these civilizations in our historical databases? Because dead species leave no historical records, Kailara replied simply. We only discovered them through archaeological investigation of worlds that showed signs of having once supported advanced civilizations. Most Council species have never bothered to investigate dead worlds in the Outer Rim territories. This was a pointed criticism, and several representatives shifted uncomfortably. The Outer Rim had always been considered a wasteland, too far from established trade routes to be worth exploring systematically. But the pattern is clear, Kilara continued. Every species that has achieved interstellar travel and survived long enough to make contact with the galactic community has done so because they developed their technology in regions where this unknown force was not actively monitoring. We have all been living in the shadows of a predator that selectively culls developing civilizations. The chamber erupted in voices as representatives began speaking simultaneously in dozens of different languages and communication methods. Some demanded additional proof, others questioned the methodology of the investigation, and a few simply expressed the opinion that the entire briefing was a waste of time. But Kethvar noticed that none of them were questioning the basic competence of the research itself. Despite their fear and discomfort, they were treating Kailara as a credible scientist whose findings deserved serious consideration. Sarah Chen stood up, and somehow her simple action caused the chaos to die down. I think what everyone is trying to ask is, what does this mean for current galactic security? If this force is still active, why haven't they targeted any existing Council worlds? An excellent question, Captain Chen, Kilara said, her voices carrying a note of appreciation. Our analysis suggests that the unknown force targets civilizations based on specific criteria. They appear to eliminate species that develop interstellar travel but have not yet established diplomatic contact with existing galactic powers. She manipulated the holographic display again, showing the current boundaries of Council space. Every current Council species achieved interstellar travel and made contact with at least one other spacefaring civilization before expanding significantly beyond their home systems. The unknown force seems to target isolated species that might develop into independent powers. You're suggesting they're trying to prevent competition, said Representative Mordak of the Thrakari Empire, his deep voice rumbling through the chamber's translation systems. Or they're trying to maintain the current balance of power in the galaxy, Sarah added thoughtfully. If you eliminate developing civilizations before they can establish themselves, you ensure that the existing powers remain dominant. The logic was disturbing but undeniable. The pattern suggested not random destruction, but systematic manipulation of galactic development. Someone was actively shaping the evolution of civilization across the galaxy. There is more, Kilara said, and her tentacles moved in patterns that indicated reluctance to continue. Our investigation has revealed evidence that this unknown force may be preparing for a new phase of activity. The holographic display shifted to show energy readings and gravitational anomalies from the Outer Rim territories. The data was complex, but the implications were clear. Something massive was moving in the empty spaces between star systems. For the past 6 months, we have detected unusual gravitational disturbances in 17 different sectors of the Outer Rim. The disturbances suggest the presence of artificial structures of enormous size, possibly larger than entire star systems. This information caused another eruption of concerned voices throughout the chamber. Structures larger than star systems suggested technology beyond anything the Council had ever encountered. If I may, Sarah said, standing again to address the chamber, I think we need to focus on what we can actually do about this situation. Kylara, what are you recommending? First, we must organize joint expeditions to investigate the gravitational anomalies in the Outer Rim. We need to understand what we are facing before we can develop appropriate responses. Second, we must establish early warning systems throughout Council space to detect the energy signatures associated with this unknown weapon. And third, we must begin developing defensive technologies based on our analysis of how the weapon operates. It was a reasonable set of recommendations. The kind of measured response that any competent scientist might propose when faced with a potential threat. But Kethvar could see the resistance building throughout the chamber. The problem wasn't the recommendations themselves. The problem was that implementing them would require extensive cooperation with the Death Korai, and most of the representatives could barely tolerate being in the same room with Kilara for the length of her presentation. Representative Thelnara voiced what many were thinking. While we appreciate the thoroughness of this research, implementing such recommendations would require significant resource allocation and cooperation between our science divisions. Such cooperation would need to be
extensive and ongoing. The delicate phrasing couldn't disguise what she was really saying. Working closely with the Death Korai would be extremely difficult for most Council species.
With respect, Ambassador Thelnara, Sarah said, and her voice carried an edge of steel. Are you suggesting that species prejudice is more important than galactic security? The question hung in the air like a weapon.
No representative wanted to answer it directly, because any answer would reveal uncomfortable truths about their own attitudes and limitations. Captain Chen, said Harmony of 7 voices, their crystalline form shifting to indicate careful diplomatic phrasing. The human diplomatic corps is relatively new to galactic politics. Perhaps you do not fully understand the complexities involved in interspecies cooperation. Oh, I understand the complexities just fine, Sarah replied. I understand that everyone in this room is more concerned about being uncomfortable than they are about the possibility that some unknown force might decide to eliminate us all. She walked to the center of the chamber, positioning herself next to Kilara. The visual contrast was striking. The small, plainly dressed human standing calmly beside the writhing mass of dark tentacles and alien features. Let me tell you something about humans, Sarah continued, addressing the entire chamber. We evolved on a planet that tried to kill us every single day. We had predators, diseases, natural disasters, and environmental conditions that would make most of your homeworlds look like vacation resorts. And you know how we survived? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. We learned to work with anyone and anything that was willing to help us survive. We made allies out of species that other predators feared. We domesticated creatures that could have killed us. We learned to cooperate with beings that looked nothing like us, thought nothing like us, and often wanted to eat us. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. So when I look at Kylara, I don't see a monster. I see a scientist who has uncovered evidence of a threat to our entire civilization, and who has come here asking for help to address that threat. And when I look at all of you, I see people who are so concerned about being afraid that you're willing to ignore a potential extinction-level event. The chamber was completely silent now. No one seemed to know how to respond to such a direct challenge to their fundamental assumptions about interspecies relations.
The way I see it, Sarah continued, you have two choices.
You can overcome your discomfort and work with the Death Karai to investigate this threat, or you can maintain your prejudices and hope that whatever destroyed 17 civilizations over the past 12,000 years decides to leave you alone. She looked around the chamber, meeting the gaze of every representative who was brave enough to look back at her. But understand this. If you choose prejudice over survival, and if this unknown force does come for us, don't expect humanity to waste resources defending civilizations that were too afraid to defend themselves. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Humanity might be the newest member of the Galactic Council, but they were also the only species that seemed capable of working effectively with anyone, regardless of appearance or cultural differences. If they withdrew their cooperation, many of the Council's most successful diplomatic initiatives would collapse. Representative Keistal of the Regelian Confederacy was the first to break the silence. Captain Chen raises valid points about the security implications of this information. Perhaps we should establish a working group to evaluate these findings more thoroughly. With full Death Korai participation, Sarah added firmly. Of course, Keistal agreed, though his tone suggested the concession was reluctant. And with authority to access resources and personnel from all Council species, Sarah continued. That would need to be approved by the full Council, Ambassador Thelnara interjected. Then let's approve it, Sarah said simply. I call for an immediate vote on the establishment of a joint security investigation, with full authority to investigate these threats and develop appropriate responses. Kethvar realized that Sarah had maneuvered the entire council into a position where they could not refuse, without appearing to prioritize their prejudices over galactic security. It was a masterful display of diplomatic pressure, made more effective by the fact that it was delivered without any apparent calculation or political cunning. The vote, when it came, was closer than it should have been. Several species abstained rather than vote directly, and a few representatives requested delays for consultation with their home governments. But in the end, the measure passed by a narrow margin. The Galactic Council had officially committed to working with the Death Karai on matters of galactic security. As the representatives filed out of the chamber, most of them still avoiding direct eye contact with Kailara, Kethvar reflected on what had just occurred. In a single afternoon, humanity had forced the entire galactic community to confront prejudices that had shaped interspecies relations for decades. But he also realized that this was just the beginning. Passing a resolution was easy compared to the actual work of implementing it. The real test would come when council scientists had to work directly with Death Karai researchers, when military officers had to coordinate with beings they found terrifying, and when diplomats had to negotiate with representatives they could barely look at. Sarah walked over to where Kailara was gathering her presentation materials. Well, that went better than expected, she said cheerfully. Captain Chen, Kailara said, her multiple voices creating a harmony of gratitude. I do not have words in any language to express my appreciation for what you have done here today. You don't need to thank me, Sarah replied. You did the hard work of uncovering this threat and preparing the evidence. I just made sure people listened to you. Though, I have to warn you, getting the vote was the easy part. Actually working with some of these species is going to be much more challenging. I understand, Kailara said. But for the first time in my career, I have hope that we might be able to address this threat before it becomes a catastrophe. As Kethvar watched them work out the initial details of the joint investigation, he realized that he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. A true alliance based not on mutual benefit or shared fear, but on the simple recognition that survival sometimes required looking past surface differences to focus on deeper truths. Whether that alliance would be strong enough to face whatever was moving in the darkness between the stars remained to be seen. 6 months after the Emergency Council session, the Joint Research Station designated as Deep Observatory 1 hung in the darkness between star systems, its sophisticated sensor arrays reaching into the void of the Outer Rim territories. The station itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, featuring environmental sections designed to accommodate the needs of 17 different species, working together on the most ambitious scientific project in galactic history. Captain Sarah Chen floated in the zero-gravity observation deck, watching as the night shift went about their duties in the sections visible through the transparent aluminum windows. In the crystalline collective workspace, Harmony of Seven Voices worked alongside a team of Death Karai researchers, their translucent form refracting the bioluminescent patterns that Kailara's team used for complex mathematical communication. The sight would have been unthinkable just months ago. Now it was becoming routine. Captain Chen? The voice belonged to Dr. Broll, Marcus Webb, the station's human psychology specialist. He drifted over from the central command area, his expression carrying the mix of excitement and concern that had become standard for everyone working on the project. What's the latest, Marcus?
We've got another confirmed sighting.
The gravitational anomaly in Sector 15 has definitely moved closer to the galactic plane. Kylara's calculations suggest it will reach the outer edge of Council space within 18 months. Sarah nodded, though the news was hardly surprising. For the past 6 months, the mysterious structures had been slowly but steadily moving inward from the galaxy's outer regions. Whatever they were no longer content to remain in the empty spaces between star systems. Any progress on understanding what we're dealing with? That's where things get interesting, Marcus said, activating a portable holographic display. Kylara and her team have been analyzing the energy patterns from all 17 anomalies, and they found something remarkable. The structures aren't just moving randomly. They're coordinating their movements with mathematical precision. The display showed the current positions of all known anomalies, with projected movement patterns extending into the future. The trajectories formed a complex but clearly intentional pattern, like pieces of some vast mechanism sliding into position. They're forming a containment sphere around the entire galactic core, Sarah realized. They're not preparing to attack individual worlds, they're preparing to isolate the entire Council region from the rest of the galaxy. That's Kylara's theory as well. But she's also discovered something else. The energy signatures from the anomalies match quantum field fluctuations that occur naturally near black holes. She thinks these structures might be artificial constructs designed to manipulate space-time on a massive scale. The implications were staggering. Technology capable of manipulating space-time could make entire regions of the galaxy unreachable, effectively trapping civilizations within defined boundaries. It suggested a level of technological advancement that made Council science look primitive by comparison. Where is Kylara now? Sarah asked. In the deep analysis lab with the Valish quantum physicists. They've been working around the clock to understand how the containment field might operate. Sarah pushed off from the wall and began floating toward the research sections. The months of working together had broken down many of the barriers that had initially made cooperation difficult, but she knew that progress had come at a personal cost for many of the non-human researchers. It wasn't easy to overcome millions of years of evolutionary fear responses, even when rational minds understood the necessity. The Deep Analysis Lab was a marvel of adaptive technology, with environmental controls that allowed beings from different atmospheric backgrounds to work in the same space. Sarah found Kylara suspended in a specialized chamber filled with the high-pressure, high-humidity environment that her species required, while Ambassador Thelnara of the Valish delegation worked at a quantum computation interface designed for beings who perceived reality in multiple dimensions simultaneously.
Captain Chen! Kylara's multiple voices called out as Sarah entered.
Perfect timing. We have achieved a breakthrough in our understanding of the containment mechanism. The holographic displays around the lab showed complex mathematical models that hurt Sarah's eyes to look at directly. She had learned to trust the experts on matters of advanced physics, but she also knew that her role was to translate their discoveries into practical action. Give me the simplified version, she requested. The structures are designed to create what we might call dimensional barriers, Ambassador Thelnara explained, her ethereal voice carrying notes of both fascination and concern. They will essentially fold space-time around the galactic core, making it impossible for any form of matter or energy to cross the boundary. They're building a prison, Kylara added, her tentacles moving in patterns of agitation. Once the containment field is activated, no Council species will be able to expand beyond their current territories. We will be permanently isolated from the rest of the galaxy. And based on the energy requirements for such a project, Thelnara continued, maintaining the containment field would require the total destruction of several star systems to power it. The civilizations living in those systems would be consumed as fuel for their own imprisonment. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lab's environmental systems. The unknown force wasn't just trying to prevent expansion, they were preparing to turn the entire galactic core into a closed system, where Council civilizations would eventually exhaust their resources and die out naturally. How long before the containment field is operational? She asked. 14 to 16 months, based on current movement patterns, Kylara replied. Once the structures reach their final positions, the field could be activated within a matter of days. And our options for stopping it? The question hung in the air for several long moments. Finally, Thelnara spoke, her voice carrying the weight of reluctant conclusions. Our analysis suggests that the only way to prevent the containment field from being activated would be to physically destroy the structures before they reach their final positions. But the energy requirements for such an attack would exceed the combined military capabilities of all Council species.
Unless, Kylara added, her voices carrying a note of uncertainty, we could find a way to turn the structure's own power systems against them. Sarah looked at the complex display surrounding them, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing.
You're talking about sabotage on a galactic scale. We are talking about survival, Kylara corrected.
But yes, it would require infiltrating structures that are larger than most star systems and are protected by technology we do not understand. It would also require getting close enough to the structures to attempt such sabotage, Thelnara added. Our long-range sensors can detect them, but we have no ships capable of approaching them safely. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking through the problem. Then a thought occurred to her that made her smile despite the grim circumstances. What if we don't try to approach them from outside, she asked. Both researchers looked at her with confusion clearly visible despite their alien features. The structures have been moving inward from the outer rim, Sarah continued. Which means they started somewhere even further out. What if there are other structures, support facilities, staging areas, maybe even the builders themselves, still operating in the regions beyond where we've been looking? Kylara's tentacles moved in rapid patterns as she processed the idea. You are suggesting we search for the source of these structures rather than attempting to attack the structures themselves. I'm suggesting we find out who built them and ask them nicely to stop, Sarah said with the kind of casual confidence that had become her trademark. And if asking nicely doesn't work, maybe we can convince them that imprisoning an entire galactic civilization is a bad idea. Captain Chen, Thelnara said carefully. The beings capable of constructing such technology would be so far advanced beyond Council science that we would have nothing to offer them. What could we possibly use to negotiate with entities that can manipulate space-time itself? Sarah's smile widened. The same thing we use to convince all of you to work with the Death Karai. We'll show them that judging others by their appearance or capabilities is a mistake. The idea was audacious to the point of seeming insane. But as Sarah outlined her reasoning, both researchers found themselves drawn into the logic of it. Think about it, Sarah continued. These builders have been systematically eliminating developing civilizations for thousands of years. They've been operating on the assumption that new species represent threats that must be contained or destroyed. But what if we could prove them wrong? How would we prove such a thing? Kylara asked. By showing them what we've accomplished here. 6 months ago, half the species in the Council couldn't stand to be in the same room with your people. Now we have crystalline collective researchers working directly with Death Karai scientists, Valish quantum physicists, sharing data with human engineers, and Mokaran traders providing logistical support for a project that has no immediate profit potential. Sarah gestured toward the lab around them, where beings from radically different evolutionary backgrounds were working together on problems that none of them could solve alone. We've created something that the Builder's model says should be impossible. Genuine cooperation between species that evolved in completely different environments with completely different survival strategies. If we can make them understand that diversity makes us stronger rather than more dangerous, maybe we can convince them that we're not a threat worth containing. It was, Thelnara had to admit, a uniquely human approach to the problem. Most species would focus on military solutions or technological countermeasures. Only humans would consider diplomacy with beings who had been systematically committing genocide for millennia. There is one problem with your proposal, Kylara pointed out. How do we locate these builders? Our sensors can barely detect their structures at extreme range. Finding their home base or command center would require searching regions of space that we have never even mapped. Actually, said a new voice from the lab entrance, that might not be as difficult as you think. Dr. Fisek, Webb floated into the lab, carrying a datapad with an expression of barely contained excitement. I've been analyzing the psychological profiles of the species that were destroyed by the unknown weapon, based on the archaeological evidence that Kylara's team collected. He activated his datapad, displaying a complex sociological analysis. Every one of the destroyed species showed similar characteristics. They were highly aggressive, rapidly expanding, and had social structures based on domination and conquest. They were exactly the kind of civilizations that would pose a threat to established galactic powers. You are suggesting the builders are selective in their targets, Thelnara observed. More than that, Webb replied. I think the builders might be refugees. The statement caused both alien researchers to focus intently on the human psychologist. Consider the pattern, Webb continued. The first confirmed destruction was 12,000 years ago, right around the time that several major galactic civilizations experienced sudden technological advances. What if the builders aren't conquerors? What if they're the survivors of a civilization that was nearly destroyed by aggressive expansionist species? Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. They're not trying to rule the galaxy. They're trying to prevent what happened to them from happening to anyone else. By creating a controlled environment where aggressive expansion is impossible, Webb confirmed. The containment field isn't a prison. It's a protective barrier. They're trying to save us from the same fate that befell their own people. But they are willing to destroy entire star systems to power their protective barrier, Kailara pointed out. This suggests their altruism has significant limitations. Or it suggests they've been alone for so long that they've forgotten how to distinguish between threats and innocent bystanders, Sarah said thoughtfully. If they've been operating in isolation for 12,000 years, making life or death decisions about entire civilizations based on limited data, it's possible they've lost perspective on what they're trying to protect. The psychological profile made sense, but it also made their situation more complex. Convincing warriors to stop fighting was one thing. Convincing traumatized survivors to stop protecting others from imagined threats was entirely different. So how do we find them? Sarah asked. We follow the archaeological trail backwards, Kilara replied, her multiple voices carrying new excitement. If Dr. Webb's theory is correct, there should be evidence of the builders' original civilization somewhere in the regions where the oldest destructions occurred. We look for the victims, and eventually we find the survivors. And then? Then we do what humans do best, Sarah said with determination. We walk up to beings that everyone else considers too dangerous or too alien to approach, and we start a conversation. Over the following days, Deep Observatory 1 became the center of the most ambitious search and rescue operation in galactic history. Teams of researchers worked around the clock to analyze archaeological data from dozens of dead worlds, looking for clues that might point them toward the builder's point of origin. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Harmony of Seven Voices, working with a team of Death Karai archaeologists, discovered a pattern in the molecular signatures left by the unknown weapon. Each use of the weapon had left trace elements that could be dated and analyzed for their point of origin. The weapon was not manufactured. Harmony of Seven Voices reported to the assembled research teams. It appears to be a biological construct, grown rather than built, and the organic components all point to a single system of origin. The star charts showed a region of space so far from the galactic core that it had never been seriously explored by any council species. It was a sparse area with few resources and no strategic value, exactly the kind of place where refugees might hide. That's nearly 8 months of travel at maximum hyperspace velocity, pointed out Commander Jekri of the Thrakari military contingent. Even if we could assemble a diplomatic mission, we might not reach them before the containment field becomes operational. Then we'd better get started, Sarah said simply. How quickly can we put together a ship and crew for a first contact mission to the most dangerous beings in galactic history? The question should have been met with protests about the impossibility of the mission, the dangers involved, and the low probability of success. Instead, it was met with the kind of determined problem-solving that had become the hallmark of the joint research project. Within a week, they had assembled the most diverse first contact team in galactic history. Sarah would lead the diplomatic mission, accompanied by Kilara as the primary xenobiologist, Ambassador Thelnara as a specialist in quantum communication, Webb as a psychological advisor, and representatives from 6 other council species. Their ship was a modified long-range explorer, equipped with the most advanced sensor systems and communication arrays that council technology could provide. It was also equipped with something that no previous first contact mission had ever carried, a complete database of the joint research project, including documentation of how dozens of species had learned to work together despite their fundamental differences. As the ship prepared for departure from Deep Observatory 1, Sarah stood in the observation deck one last time, watching the coordinated activity of the research station. Beings that had once feared to share the same room were now working together with the easy familiarity of colleagues and friends. Nervous? Dr. Webb asked as he joined her at the viewing port. Terrified, Sarah admitted cheerfully. We're about to make first contact with beings who have been systematically eliminating species for 12,000 years, using technology we don't understand, for reasons we can only guess at. If we get this wrong, every civilization in the galaxy could be trapped in a dimensional prison until we exhaust our resources and die out. And if we get it right, Sarah smiled. If we get it right, we might just prove that the galaxy is big enough for everyone, no matter how different they are or how afraid they make everyone else. The ship departed Deep Observatory 1 6 days later, carrying a crew that represented the best hope for galactic civilization. Their destination lay in the darkness beyond the outer rim, where ancient survivors waited, with the power to imprison or liberate an entire galaxy. As they entered hyperspace and began the long journey toward the unknown, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first meeting in the transport hub of Nexus 7.
A simple refusal to judge others by their appearance had led to the greatest cooperative effort in galactic history. Now all they had to do was convince the most powerful beings in the galaxy that diversity was strength, that differences were valuable, and that the future was always better when it included everyone. Even the monsters, especially the monsters. 3 weeks into their journey, long-range sensors detected the first signs of their destination, structures that dwarfed entire solar systems, powered by technologies that bent space-time itself, and inhabited by beings who had spent 12,000 years trying to protect the galaxy from the horrors they had experienced. The real test was about to begin. As their ship approached the edge of space that no Council vessel had ever explored, Sarah stood on the bridge alongside beings that had once been too afraid to look at each other. Together, they prepared to face the unknown with the most powerful weapon in the human arsenal, the simple belief that everyone deserved a chance to be understood.
Behind them, the containment field continued to take shape around the galactic core. Ahead of them lay beings with the power to complete their ancient project or abandon it entirely, depending on whether a small group of diverse species could prove that cooperation was possible, even between the most unlikely allies. The galaxy held its breath and waited to see what happened when humanity's greatest strength met the universe's oldest fear. In the darkness between stars, ancient eyes began to turn toward the approaching ship, and for the first time in 12 millennia, the builders prepared to meet beings who might just be brave enough to change everything.